Welcome back. We are ready for chapter 6, or The Charming Mrs. Frink. So maybe we will find out if Mrs. Frink is trustworthy, is she really this nice, or not. See what your prediction is. All at once, the men of Shoalwater Bay found it very important to bathe and wash and generally look presentable. They cut their hair, they scrubbed their hands, they brushed their teeth. Even Mr. Russell attempted to shave his straggly beard in order to look more respectable, but he succeeded only in carving his face. They vied to spend a moment in Mrs. Frink's presence. With a simple smile, she had a cabin built. With a downward sweep of her lashes, she had acquired an outhouse. So an outhouse would be like an Andy Gump. With an upward turn of her lips, her garden was dug. So she's just like charming and getting all this stuff. Wow. It was perfectly astonishing. It was almost as if she were the first lady to arrive on the bay when I had been here for months and months. The men had never treated me the way they did Mrs. Frink, with a mix of awe and respect and admiration. After much worry on my part, I invited the Frinks to supper one late November day. They had taken up residence in their new cabin, which was situated on a lovely patch of land with a view of the bay, and which, I might add, the men of the settlement had built without having to be bribed with whiskey. I spent 2 days carefully planning the menu. I had learned how to cook while on Shoalwater Bay, but while I regularly cooked for the men, I had never cooked for another lady. I was well aware that the men ate anything I put before them, especially Mr. Russell, but I expected that Mrs. Frink would have a more refined palate. In the end, I settled on roast chicken, biscuits, and gravy, and a pie for dessert. Not that it mattered, for the men were far too busy paying attention to Mrs. Frink to compliment me on the excellent meal I had prepared. All they could do was listen to Mrs. Frink's witty stories of her travels west, and by the time I started clearing the dishes, the men were hanging on her every word. These men, who belched and spat at every opportunity, somehow managed to contain their belches and not spit once during the entire meal. Mrs. Frink was relating a story in which she had stayed up all night to watch the campsite because the men on the wagon train were so exhausted. Her husband, whom I had yet to hear speak, sat quietly at her side smoking his pipe. "My poor Mr. Frink," Mrs. Frink said, patting her husband's hand, had worked the work of 4 men. Why, he single-handedly pulled our wagon out of a ditch as deep and as tall as I am. What else could I do but let the perfect man sleep? Mr. Frink just puffed on his pipe. "Then what happened?" Mr. Russell asked anxiously, gray whiskers twitching. He had procured a clean shirt from somewhere, although the sleeve already had a gravy stain from where he'd used it as a napkin. "Yes, well, that was the time I shot the coyote, of course." "You can shoot?" I asked, aghast. Not only was she a lady, but she could shoot? She inclined her head slightly. "I'm a very good shot, Miss Peck. Mr. Frink taught me how to shoot." The men nodded admiringly. What are you doing? I remembered with some embarrassment my lone attempt at wielding a rifle. A cougar had been sneaking into the encampment, and I had fired at it and missed. Still, at least it had run off. Mr. Russell leaned forward, intent on capturing every word that tripped off her tongue. "You see, a coyote snuck into camp and tried to make away with our best piece of bacon. Well, I fired right at the scamp's tail, and it went yelping off into the night. And that was the last we saw of that coyote." She gave a little laugh. "That was also the last time I left the bacon out." The men clapped. I began clearing away the plates, feeling a little like a maid. Jehu quietly stood up and began gathering plates as well. "Oh, do sit down, Mr. Scudder. I shall help, Jane," Mrs. Frink offered, grandly standing. There was a clatter as, all at once, chairs were shoved back and Mr. Russell, Mr. Swan, Mr. Frink, and Karutsku stood. "Miss Peck," Mrs. Frink tittered, "you are so fortunate to be surrounded by so many gentlemen." So proper gentleman behavior is if you're sitting at a table and there's a female, when she goes to get up, the gentlemen are supposed to stand. And then also if the woman were to approach the table, the men should stand up, pull out the chair for her, and sit her down. That's like proper gentleman behavior. So they're all doing that for Mrs. Frink. But I've never heard of this for poor Jane. If I were Jane, I'd be a little irritated. The men blushed. I shot them all a dark look. Really, no one ever bothered to stand when I got up from the table. I furiously began to carve the pie I had made earlier that day. Mrs. Frink appeared with a covered dish in her hand. I brought my famous crumble cake. Mr. Frink just adores my crumble cake, she confided. My clever husband was so smart to bring that iron stove in the wagon. I just stared at the cake. You've been kindness itself, cooking supper for all of us, she continued, pressing my hand. Really, it was the least I could do. I didn't want to appear ungracious. Well, I suppose we could serve both, Mrs. Frink announced. For dessert, there is a choice of Miss Peck's pie or my crumble cake. What do you think they're going to choose? I'll take the crumble cake, Mr. Russell said quickly. For me as well, Mr. Swan said with a broad smile. Mr. Frink merely nodded in assent. I was beginning to wonder if the man had a tongue in his head. Jehu's eyes rested on my face. I'll have a piece of pie. Jane makes wonderful pie. Mrs. Frink turned to Karukso. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, and then Karukso said, a little reluctantly, Pie too. He knows she'll get mad. I smiled at him gratefully. Mr. Russell took a hearty bite of Mrs. Frink's crumble cake and closed his eyes in delight. This here's the best thing I ever tasted, he said with true fervor, devouring his slice of crumble cake in 2 quick bites, and then holding out his pie for a second helping. I'd be much obliged if you cut me another piece, ma'am. Mrs. Frink bestowed a radiant smile upon him and carved off another piece of cake. Capital cake, my dear woman. Simply marvelous, Mr. Swan declared in his effusive way, a crumble clinging to his beard. He held out his empty plate to Mrs. Frink for another piece as well. Karukso looked with real longing at the famous crumble cake, his pie untouched. What about my pie? I wanted to shout. Until now, my pie had been the best thing on Shoalwater Bay. All the men said so. Mrs. Frink was perfect. She had the manners of Miss Hepplewhite, and she could shoot a gun like a man and bake a cake better than me. Why, she even spoke perfect French. Madame Frink has read Manon Lescaut in their original, Father Joseph had told me in an impressed voice, whatever that was. I was terrible at languages and had barely learned how to say, may I have a fresh napkin, during my conversational French lessons at Miss Hepplewhite's Young Ladies' Academy. I had longed for female companionship, but now that another lady had arrived, I rather wished she'd go back to Ohio. Even Brandywine, the useless beast, followed her around. He shamelessly flipped on his back to get her to rub his plump belly. Jehu alone seemed immune to her charm. Do you like Mrs. Frink? I asked Karukso the next day as we sat on the beach in the early morning light. The sun was hiding behind a thick gray sky, and the day perfectly reflected my bad mood. He shrugged. Do you know that Mr. Russell offered to build her a chimney? That man never even offered to put up a tent for me, and now he's going to build her a chimney? Chimney is no good, Karukso said. Swan's chimney fell down. Karukso had a very poor opinion of chimneys on account of Mr. Swan's chimney crashing during a thunderstorm and almost killing us all. Yes, but that's not the point. The point is she has all the men scurrying around to help her and do things for her, and when they would never do anything for me. Karukso looked affronted. I help Boss and Jane. Yes, I didn't mean you. I meant the others. He narrowed his eyes at me. You have sick tum-tum? Sick tum-tum meant jealous. No, I'm not jealous, I hedged. Well, maybe I am, but only a little. It's just that, I blustered. I'm a lady too, but nobody ever treats me like her. Nobody ever built me an outhouse, I finished in a huff. Karukso just shook his head and said, sick tum-tum. Later that day, I was sitting on a log on the beach, trying to stitch some ribbon onto one of my skirts. I pricked my finger and realized that I would never sew a skirt as fashionable as Mrs. Frink's. No matter how hard I tried, I would never be as good as her. It was almost as if I were back in Philadelphia with Sally Biddle, except that Mrs. Frink was worse than Sally Biddle because she was so nice. Mr. Swan came tramping over, stick in his hand. His cheeks were ruddy from the crisp weather. Hello, my dear, Mr. Swan said. Capital day. It was gray and drizzly as usual. Humph, I said. Have you seen Mrs. Frink? He asked cheerfully. No. Charming woman, Mrs. Frink. Simply charming, Mr. Swan mused. Oh, I know. It's perfectly plain that the entire world thinks she's charming, I said, a bitter edge to my voice. He looked startled. My dear? I shook my head and sighed. Mr. Swan patted my hand. We are all very fond of you, my dear. They were all very fond of me? but they adored Mrs. Frink, and I was plainly not in the same class as her. I must be off, Mr. Swan cleared his throat importantly. Mrs. Frink has asked my opinion on the architectural plans for the hotel, and I have some interesting ideas, he paused. Would you like to join me? I shook my head. It was so vexing. Mr. Swan was my friend, my business partner. I wanted to ask why couldn't he have some interesting ideas about our oyster business, but instead I simply stared at the bay. Ah, well, I shall see you later then, my dear, Mr. Swan said awkwardly and walked away. I spent the rest of the afternoon stalking up and down the beach. The men could fix their own supper for once, I thought angrily, as I walked off my frustration. It would do them good to see how much work I did. They didn't appreciate me. Why, they barely remembered to thank me, not to mention no one ever offered to help clear the table, except, of course, Jehu. The sun had sunk behind the mountains when I finally returned to the cabin. I fully expected to be met by a group of angry, hungry men, but instead all that greeted me was silence. The cabin was dark, and the fire had been allowed to burn out. Where had everyone gone? And then I heard Brandywine barking. I followed the sound of his barking down the path that led to the Frink's cabin. The dog was whining piteously at the door to be let in. Was something wrong? I knocked, and after a moment the door opened. Why, hello, Miss Peck, Mrs. Frink exclaimed in delight. I looked past her shoulder, my eyes widening in surprise. Sitting around the table that bore the remains of a roast chicken supper with biscuits and gravy and mashed potatoes were all the men. Mr. Swan was happily tugging away at a big piece of Mrs. Frink's crumble cake, and the crumbs clinging to his beard. Do join us, Miss Peck, Mrs. Frink said graciously, stepping aside, but all I could do was stand there and stare at them. We were just beginning to worry about you. Jane, Jehu said, pushing back his chair. But I didn't wait to speak to him. I turned and ran off into the black night, knowing that I could disappear tomorrow and no one would miss me. No one at all. The next morning, Mrs. Frink appeared in my doorway. Miss Peck, she began carefully, would you care to come over to our cabin and have tea this afternoon? I wanted to say no, but all those years at Miss Hepplewhite's Young Ladies Academy stopped me, and I found myself saying yes and thanking her for the invitation. In short order, Mrs. Frink and I were sitting at her table across from each other. Before us sat tin cups of tea, poured by her hand and flavored perfectly with milk and sugar. I could not have poured a better cup of tea myself. Mrs. Frink smiled brightly. So tell me, Miss Peck, what have you been doing with yourself these last few months? One has so much free time without social obligations, don't you agree? That was one thing I did not miss on the trail, I confess. And here she gave a little laugh. I wanted to say that I'd been spending all my free time surviving, not to mention washing every shirt in the territory several times. Instead, I said, I rather miss calling on acquaintances. Mrs. Frink worried her lip and swallowed. Mr. Swan says that you're quite a talented watercolorist. I'm afraid that Mr. Swan was no doubt drunk when he said so. Yes, well, I'd love to see your work sometime, she tittered nervously, so I may judge for myself. Mrs. Frink's gaze settled on my hair. And you must come over another time and let me do something with your hair. I have a simply wonderful collection of combs, and I'm certain we could make a very fashionable arrangement, she said eagerly. My hand flew to my head automatically. I was wearing a bonnet to hide the bald patch, but I knew those unruly stray curls that Sally Biddle used to tease me about were escaping everywhere. No, thank you, I said coldly, and had the satisfaction of seeing Mrs. Frink's face fall. She pushed a plate of shortbread over to me. Please have some shortbread, although it's not nearly as delightful as your pie. You must please give me the receipt for that pie, Mrs. Frink said in a strained voice. She wanted the receipt so that she could make it for the men? I stood up, knocking my chair back. That receipt is a family secret. Mrs. Frink wrung her hands. Miss Peck, please forgive me. This is not what I had intended. This is going very badly indeed. Please, let us be friends. I know how hard it has been with you, your unfortunate history with Mr. Balt, and I didn't want this woman's pity. I do not appreciate your gossiping about me behind my back, I said tightly. Please excuse me. I find that I have lost my appetite. And with that, I walked quickly from the cabin. Later that afternoon, as I was cutting out biscuits for supper, the door banged open. I don't know where Mrs. Frink is, I said irritably, not looking up. Wasn't looking for Mrs. Frink, Jehu said dryly. I was looking for you. I'm making supper, I said in a dogged voice. And then without any explanation, he grabbed my hand and tugged me out the door. Jehu, I protested. He just shook his head and held my hand more tightly with his warm one. He led me along the curving beach in the opposite direction from where the Franks were constructing their hotel. And the farther we walked away from the encampment and Mrs. Frank's influence, the calmer I felt. The wind whipping off the water cooled my temper. "Where are we going?" I asked. "You'll see," he said mysteriously. We rounded a bend along the bay, and there it was, a rich green vista, mountains rising high above, sheltering the land like a cove. He led me up a rocky cliff to stand on the edge. "What do you think?" he asked. He swept his hand in front of him at the warm afternoon light dancing across the bay. Water stretched out in all directions, and the sound of soft waves lapping against the shore was soft and comforting, like Brandywine's snore. A sparkling stream ran down one side of the cliff. It was perfect, perhaps the most perfect spot on the bay. "It's lovely." He grinned, the scar in his cheek crinkling. "I thought so," he said in a very satisfied voice. I peered over the edge of the cliff. "It is a bit high." He raised a disbelieving eyebrow. "You're afraid of heights?" I nodded. Although when I was a little girl, my playmate Jebediah Park and I used to run along the rooftops, spitting at men passing far below. "You spit?" he asked, a look of pure astonishment on his face. I was very good at spitting. There were men who walked around Philadelphia all day long who never even knew that they had great gobs of spit on their hats. I couldn't help it. I giggled. Jehu roared in laughter, the sound goading me into remembrance. We were fearless, just running along the roofs. It was a whole different world. "So when did you become afraid of heights then?" he asked, puzzled. One spring day, a gentleman we spat on was so furious that he chased us halfway across Philadelphia. And just when we thought we'd escaped him, he appeared on the roof, brandishing a cane at us. I was so startled that I lost my balance and slipped. Jehu's expression silently encouraged me to continue. I fell, but I grabbed onto the ledge and just hung on. The man came over and hauled me up, but only after letting me dangle there for what seemed like forever, wondering whether or not I was going to fall to my death. I swallowed hard, remembering the sheer terror of hovering above the street, my fingers grappling the loose bricks. After he finally pulled me up, he took one look at my white face and said in a satisfied voice, "I don't think you'll be spitting on hats anymore." Jehu whistled through his teeth, so like her face was white or pale, like she thought she was going to die. "And he was right," I said with a weak smile. "Oh, Jane," Jehu said, taking my shoulders in his hands and looking at me, his eyes so clear with, what? Worry for the little girl who had once been fearless? But it didn't matter because all at once I remembered the feel of his lips against mine as we danced beneath a starry sky mere months ago. He had held me then, too, his hands warm about my waist, and we were spinning, spinning, spinning. "I've put in a claim," he said abruptly. "Oh," I said. "I was thinking I'd build a house right here. I know you like to look at the bay." I looked into the eyes of this quiet, sturdy, dependable man, and now saw his desire to please me so clearly on his tanned face. "It's going to have a balcony on the water." He leaned into me, his arms at my waist now, his body warm. "And there'll be steps leading to the beach." He leaned even closer, his breath tickling my ear. "And there's a grove of trees with a slope just on the edge of the property line." The wind seemed to blow gently, like a sigh humming between us. And to think that I had once turned him away because of William Balt, a man who wanted to marry me to get more land. "Jehu," I said, tugging his head down to mine. "And on the other side of that," he breathed, his cheek brushing against mine, his unshaven face tickling like so many butterfly wings, "there's another plot of land that I'd like to put in a claim for." Something cold settled in my chest. "Another claim?" I said in a dull voice, remembering William's schemes. "Yes. You see, I have plans to—" But I wasn't listening anymore. I suddenly knew why he'd brought me here. He wanted to marry me to get more land, just like William Balt. For land, not me. I yanked away from the circle of his arms. "You're despicable. I want—" "Oh, I know exactly what you want," I bit out furiously. Jehu stared at me, a bewildered expression on his face. "Boston Jane!" I turned to the voice, grateful for the distraction. Sudie was running toward us, crying. Jehu dropped my hand, his jaws muscles working. "Boston Jane!" Sudie cried anxiously, her small face streaked with tears. The little girl flung herself into my arms and began sobbing in earnest. I held her tight, refusing to meet Jehu's eyes. After a moment, I set her away gently. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" She thrust a small bundle into my hands. It was her clam doll, or what was left of it, anyway. "Brandywine ate Dolly," Sooty cried and burst into tears again. "Oh, dear," I said. "Jane," Jehu said in a low voice. I ignored him and gave Sooty a hug, glaring over her shoulder at him. He flung up his hands and stalked away. She didn't even really give him a chance to explain. He's like, "I know you love this spot. I'm going to claim this land." And he's describing the house that he's going to build there. And I think she thinks, like, he wants them to marry or something. And then when he mentions the other spot of land, then suddenly she thinks something else. But she didn't even really let him explain. She's always spazzing out. All right, until we meet again.